The boy on the stretcher did not look 18 years old. His ribs were counting themselves under his skin, his eyes too big for his face, and the scale under his body stopped at just 72 pounds. The American medic checked the numbers again, thinking the scale must be broken. It was not. This was the weight that months of starvation, forced marches, and cold had carved out of a once strong German farm boy. And as the medic began the examination, he realized that the numbers were only the beginning of the shock. What they found inside that teenager's body would change how the entire camp thought about their enemy. The story begins on a hot afternoon inside a prisoner of war camp in the United States, near the end of World War II. An army ambulance stopped by the small wooden hospital building, and several guards stepped out, carrying a stretcher between them. On that stretcher lay an 18-year-old German soldier, wrapped in a thin blanket that did almost nothing to hide how little was left of him. The camp hospital smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and old wood. Fans rattled from the ceiling, trying and failing to push away the heavy summer air. By this point in the war, the American staff had seen many prisoners of war arrive sick, wounded, or broken by the journey. But when they lifted the blanket from this young man, the room went quiet in a way that people remembered for years. His name was Karl. He had been a farm boy in a small village in western Germany before the war swept him out of his fields and into a uniform. Now he looked like a shadow of that boy. His arms were as thin as broom handles. His ankles seemed too small to hold his body. His face had the hollow, sharp look that only long hunger can carve. The medic in charge that day had treated wounded soldiers from the front and prisoners from several camps. He had seen bullet wounds, shattered bones, and infections that turned flesh black. But nothing prepared him for the number that appeared when he slid the scale under Karl and carefully shifted his weight. 72 pounds. For a moment, the medic thought his eyes were playing a trick on him. Karl was tall, or at least he would have been if he could stand straight. At 18 years old, his bones should have been growing, his muscles filling out. Instead, he weighed less than a healthy 12-year-old child. The medic made him step off the scale, tapped it, reset it, and tried again. The number did not change. How had a boy this young and once strong enough to do farm work from dawn to dusk been reduced to that weight? To answer that, the story has to go back to Germany, to the collapse of the front, and to the long journey that brought him to this camp in the first place. Before the war, Karl's world was small. He woke before sunrise to help his father with the animals, shoveled hay, carried buckets, and walked the same dirt roads his grandparents had walked. His hands became rough, his shoulders strong, and his parents assumed he would inherit the farm one day. But by 1943, Germany was running out of men. The war had already taken fathers, older brothers, and village teachers. Now the army wanted the youngest sons. Posters appeared promising honor, duty, and adventure. Rumors spread that anyone who refused would be branded a coward. For Karl, there was hardly any choice. He was drafted into a unit that mixed young recruits with a few hardened veterans. Training was quick and rough. There was no time to turn boys into polished soldiers. They were given uniforms that sometimes did not fit, old rifles, and just enough instruction to follow orders and march in line. Then they were sent toward the front, where the war was already turning against Germany. Karl had grown up hearing that his country was strong and that the war would be won. Instead, he found retreating columns, burned villages, and lines of wounded men stretching back from the front. There were days with little food and nights spent digging trenches under artillery fire. He learned quickly, not from training manuals, but from the frightened whispers of older soldiers who had already seen too much. One evening, his unit was ordered to hold a ruined village against advancing Allied forces. They had almost no heavy weapons and little ammunition. The veterans quietly told the younger ones to memorize escape routes, but there was nowhere to run. The shelling started before dawn. Walls shook, windows shattered, and the air filled with dust and smoke. By midday, some of the German positions had gone silent. When the American infantry finally moved in, stepping carefully over rubble and bodies, they found small groups of stunned, hungry, and exhausted soldiers who could barely lift their rifles. Karl's squad surrendered in a half-collapsed basement, their hands shaking more from weakness than from fear. For Karl, the war as a fighter ended that day, but his struggle for survival had barely begun. Capture did not mean safety. It meant uncertainty, hunger, and a new kind of fear. Karl and hundreds of other German prisoners of war were marched away from the front under guard. They walked along roads crowded with other columns, artillery, and supply trucks. Dust baked their throats, and the sun burned the backs of their necks. At first, the guards were strict but not cruel. They shouted orders, checked ranks, and kept the prisoners moving. Water came when there was time and supplies. Food came when it was available, which was not every day. The war's supply lines were stretched, and prisoners were low on the list. Karl still had some strength left at the beginning. He shared what little bread he had with a friend from training. They made promises to each other that they would reach the camp together, no matter how far it was. But as days turned into weeks, that promise grew harder to keep. The prisoners of war were moved from an improvised holding camp in Europe to a crowded transit camp near a port. There they waited behind barbed wire for transport to a permanent camp. They slept in tents or under open sky, huddling together when it rained. Rations were small, soup that was mostly water, pieces of bread that disappeared in 3 bites. By the time Karl was herded up the gangplank of a ship bound for the United States, he had already lost weight. His uniform hung a little looser. His cheeks had begun to hollow. The ocean voyage did not help. The prisoners were kept under deck in crowded spaces. The air smelled of sweat, sickness, and metal. Many were seasick and could not keep their food down. Days blurred together. Guards allowed short breaks on deck in small groups. Karl stared at the endless water and felt both fear and a strange sense of relief. He was no longer in a war zone, but he had no idea what waited for him on the other side. When the ship finally reached an American port, the prisoners were lined up again, counted, and loaded into trains. The American railway system could move thousands of prisoners of war deep into the country. Some went to camps in the south, others to the Midwest or the plains. Karl's group was sent toward a camp surrounded by fields and guarded towers. During the train journey, the food improved slightly but not enough to repair months of damage from the front and the marches. They were given simple U.S. Army rations, but their stomachs had already shrunk. Some prisoners could barely eat a full portion without feeling sick. Karl tried to eat everything he was given, but his body struggled to absorb it. By the time he reached the camp, he was weaker than he realized. His legs shook when he stepped off the train. His belt had to be tightened to its last hole to keep his trousers from slipping. He joined the line of prisoners tramping through the camp gate, under the watchful eyes of American guards and the silent stare of the guard towers. The camp looked, at first glance, like a small town made of wood and wire. There were rows of long barracks, a mess hall, a small hospital building, and watchtowers at the corners. The fences were topped with rolls of barbed wire. Inside, dirt paths ran between the buildings, and prisoners of war in faded German uniforms walked them in small groups. For many German prisoners of war, American camps were a shock. They had heard stories that they might be beaten or shot on sight. Instead, they found a system built on regulations, rations, and routines. That did not mean kindness, and it did not mean comfort. It meant order. Karl was assigned to a barrack with long wooden bunks stacked in 2 or 3 levels. The mattresses were thin, stuffed with straw. Blankets were scratchy but clean. At night, the barrack echoed with coughs, snoring, and restless turning. Men talked quietly about home, about letters they hoped to receive, and about rumors of how the war was going. In theory, every prisoner of war was supposed to receive regular meals, often based on American Army rations. There might be bread, soup, beans, and sometimes meat. But Karl's body had already been pushed close to its limits. It had been starved in stages on the front during the marches and through the transport chain. Now, even with more regular meals, his organs struggled to recover. He tried to work when his name appeared on labor lists. Some prisoners of war were sent to nearby farms or work details, earning small credits they could spend in the camp canteen. But Karl often felt dizzy and lightheaded. He would stand up too fast and see the world tilt. Other prisoners began to notice how thin he had become. One evening, after roll call, Karl's bunkmate watched him climb to his bed and saw how his hands trembled as he gripped the ladder. The bunkmate quietly went to a camp medic and said that the young man needed help. In a system that processed thousands of prisoners, it would have been easy for Karl to be ignored. But this time, someone listened. The next morning, guards came to the barrack and called his name. They told him to bring his blanket and follow them. The other prisoners of war watched as he shuffled down the aisle, the blanket hanging over one arm. Some assumed he was in trouble. Others knew that if the guards took you to the hospital building, it could mean that your body was finally losing the battle. Carl tried to walk, but his legs would not carry him far. By the time he reached the main yard, his knees buckled. A guard swore under his breath, then signaled for a stretcher. 2 men came running with it, and Carl was lifted up, his lightness shocking even the men who had carried wounded soldiers before. Inside the camp hospital, American medics moved quickly. They had a routine for new patients: check temperature, check pulse, check blood pressure, record weight and height. For Carl, this routine turned into something that would be talked about long after the war. They slid him off the stretcher and helped him stand on the scale. The metal platform felt cold under his bare feet. He gripped the medic's arm to keep from falling. The medic leaned in, watching the needle settle. It stopped at 72 pounds. The room seemed to pause. One of the assistants let out a low whistle before catching himself. Another muttered that the scale must be broken. The medic shook his head. He had seen enough emaciated bodies to trust his eyes. Still, he reset the scale, asked Carl to step off, then step back on. Again, the same number. The medic wrote it down, then added a note beside it: severely underweight, possible organ damage, immediate intervention required. For an 18-year-old boy of Carl's height, the normal weight range would have been nearly double what the scale showed. This was not simple thinness. This was starvation. The shock went beyond the number. As they began the full medical examination, the medics found more signs of what the war had done to this teenager's body. His heartbeat was irregular and weak. There were signs of past infections that had never fully healed. Old bruises from beatings or falls had left faint marks. His muscles had wasted away so badly that when they pressed his arms or legs, they felt more bone than flesh. They tested his reflexes and found them sluggish. They checked his gums and saw the pale color of someone lacking essential vitamins for a long time. His stomach was sensitive to touch, a warning sign that his internal organs had taken damage from months of malnutrition and stress. This was the body of someone who had been starved slowly, not in a single disaster, but through constant shortage and neglect. For some of the American staff, this was a turning point. Up to that moment, it had been easy to think of German prisoners of war as the enemy in simple terms. They wore the other side's uniform. They spoke the language of the country that had bombed cities and invaded neighbors. But looking at Carl on that hospital bed, they saw not a symbol but a broken teenager. The medics did not only see a patient, they also saw a set of numbers that told a larger story. Carl was 18 years old. He weighed 72 pounds. He had likely spent months on reduced rations before capture. Then he had endured marches, crowding, and unstable access to food. In many prisoner of war systems during World War II, ration levels changed with the progress of the war. When supply lines were strong, prisoners received more calories. When the front collapsed, they received less. In some cases, prisoners went days with little more than watery soup and small pieces of bread. Imagine a teenager who needs at least 2,000 calories a day just to maintain his weight. Now imagine that, for months, he receives half of that or less. At first, the body burns stored fat. Then it begins to consume muscle. In the end, it even starts to damage vital organs. The medics estimated that Carl's body had lost not just fat but a large share of its muscle mass. His bones stood out like scaffolding under his skin. Where there should have been firm flesh, there was only loose skin and sharp edges. The human body, when starved for long enough, becomes a map of what it has lost. Inside the camp, other numbers told their own story. There were hundreds, sometimes thousands, of German prisoners of war held behind the wire. Many were thin. Some coughed constantly. Others bore scars from wounds and infections. But Carl's case was extreme even by the standards of that time and place. When the camp doctor reviewed the chart, he underlined the weight figure and circled it. He ordered that Carl be given carefully increased rations, not a sudden flood of food. The danger with someone that's starved is that the wrong kind of refeeding can overload the heart and other organs. They had to bring him back piece by piece. Carl's war had changed from bullets and artillery to something quieter, but just as serious. Now, every day was a battle between his damaged body and the food on the tray next to his bed. Nurses and medics brought him small, frequent meals instead of large ones. They watched how his stomach reacted. They listened to his heartbeat with extra care after every increase in calories. At first, Carl could barely finish a meal. His stomach had shrunk. Even simple food left him feeling full too quickly. But the medical staff encouraged him gently. They told him that his only duty now was to eat, to rest, and to let his body rebuild. Some of the guards began to stop by the hospital during their rounds. They had heard about the 72-pound boy. They had seen prisoners of war before, but none this thin. Seeing him changed how they talked, at least in private. It was harder to speak with easy hatred when the enemy looked like a fragile patient on a cot. Carl's fellow prisoners of war also reacted. Some felt a sting of shame when they realized how bad his condition had been before the hospital took him in. They had all been hungry. They had all been tired. But they had also learned to look away from the worst cases, because looking too closely meant facing their own fear. Now, with word spreading about the 18-year-old in the hospital, they had to face it. One day, during a quiet afternoon, the medic who had weighed Carl sat by his bed and asked about his life before the war. Carl spoke slowly, his voice still weak. He talked about cows, fields, and the smell of bread in his mother's kitchen. The medic listened, imagining his own small town in the United States, not so different in size or rhythm. The distance between us and them shrank a little in that moment. Meanwhile, outside the camp, the war moved toward its end. News of German cities being bombed and of fronts collapsing filtered through rumors, newspapers, and the guarded words of censors. Prisoners of war wondered whether they still had homes to return to. Guards wondered what would happen when all these men behind the wire were no longer enemies, but former enemies. Inside the hospital, double shifts and ration adjustments continued. Carl's weight began to climb, but slowly. 75 pounds, then 80. Each small gain was recorded on his chart like steps up a steep hill. The medics remained cautious. Organs that have been starved for so long can fail unexpectedly. Recovery was not guaranteed. Stories have power in closed worlds like prisoner of war camps. Soon, the tale of the 18-year-old who arrived at 72 pounds was retold in different barracks. Some exaggerated it, others downplayed it, but almost everyone knew the basic facts. For some prisoners of war, Carl's condition became a symbol of what they had all been through, even if in less extreme form. They pointed to him when they argued about responsibility. Was it the German leadership that had led them into this disaster? Was it the collapse of supply lines? Was it the brutality of some camp systems before they were captured by the Americans? There were no simple answers, only anger and confusion. For the American staff, his case raised uncomfortable questions. If someone could arrive in this state, how many others were on the edge without it being obvious yet? They began to look more closely at the men in the yard, at the way uniforms hung loose, at the drawn faces. More medical checks were ordered. More attention was paid to those who stumbled during roll call or who skipped meals. One guard, who had lost a brother in Europe, admitted privately to a fellow soldier that seeing Carl had shaken him. He had wanted to hate every man in a German uniform, but it was hard to direct that hatred at a boy who looked as if a strong wind could blow him away. The guard did not suddenly become gentle. He still enforced rules. He still carried his rifle. Yet something in his tone changed when he addressed the prisoners of war on work details. The camp did not turn into a place of comfort. It remained a prison. There were still punishments for breaking rules. There was still the sharp edge of the barbed wire, and the constant reminder that freedom was on the other side of the fence. But Carl's case had shown everyone, prisoners and guards alike, how close to the edge a human body could be pushed. Once a story like that lodges itself in the mind of a community, it does not leave easily. Before the next part of this story continues, there is something important to ask of everyone listening. These stories reach people in many countries and many languages. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? It helps to know who is keeping these histories alive and who is listening to the voices that were almost lost. Now, back to the hospital bed where a teenager was trying to climb back toward life. Recovery from extreme starvation is rarely a straight line. Some days, Carl felt a little stronger. He could sit up for longer periods, talk more, and even joke softly with the nurses. Other days, he woke tired, his chest tight, his head heavy. The medical staff monitored him closely for refeeding problems. They checked his blood pressure and pulse repeatedly. They adjusted the balance of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates in his meals as best they could with camp supplies. They knew that if they moved too fast, his heart might not keep up. If they moved too slow, his body might slide backward again. Outside his window, the camp moved through its daily rhythm. Roll calls, work details leaving through the gate and returning in the evening, card games in the yard, letters read and reread until the paper thinned. Carl watched it all from a distance, a reminder that even within prison there were levels of confinement. As the days turned into weeks, something else changed. News began to filter through more clearly. Reports of German surrender in some regions, of cities falling, of leaders disappearing from public view. The prisoners of war gathered around those who could read newspapers in English or who had heard the guards talking. They tried to piece together the shape of a war they could no longer see. One afternoon, after a particularly hopeful report about the possibility of the war ending soon, a nurse leaned toward Carl and said quietly that he needed to keep fighting. "By the time you go home," she said, "you should be strong enough to walk off the ship on your own." It was a simple statement, but it planted a seed. Up to that point, Carl had been focused on surviving each day. Now he began to imagine a moment years later when he might step onto a dock, look around, and breathe air that was not filtered through barbed wire. That hope, small as it was, gave weight to every spoonful of food he forced down when his stomach protested. Hope can be as real a medicine as any injection in a place like that. It does not cure infection or repair organs, but it keeps you lifting the spoon to your lips when it would be easier to let your hand fall. By now, many of those listening have stayed with this young man through his worst days and his fragile recovery. If you are finding value in hearing these untold accounts from prisoners of war, there is a way to make sure these stories continue. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. This channel brings stories that most history books never covered, and every subscription helps to keep these memories from fading. Now, let us return to Carl's final months inside the camp, and what they did to him long after the war ended. The end of World War II did not come to the camp in a single explosion of celebration. It arrived in fragments. Rumors of surrender, snatches of radio broadcasts, sudden changes in the guards' moods, but slowly the reality became clear. Germany had been defeated. For the prisoners of war, the news brought a complicated mix of emotions. Some felt relief that the bombing and fighting would finally stop. Others felt dread about what they would find when they returned, if they returned at all. Would their families be alive? Would their homes still stand? Or would they be stepping into rubble? For Carl, the end of the war meant that his future no longer involved returning to the front. The camp remained locked. The fences still stood. But now the wire enclosed men who were no longer active enemies, but captives in waiting, held until political agreements decided their fate. The medical staff knew that their responsibility did not end with the armistice. Bodies did not heal just because politicians signed papers. Carl's weight slowly climbed higher. 90 pounds, then 100. The number still sat below what would be healthy for a young man of his height, but it was a long way from 72. His cheeks filled out. His eyes, once huge and sunken, began to look more normal, though there would always be a trace of that starvation gaze. The medics examined his heart and lungs again. They listened carefully for any sign of permanent damage. They knew that some scars cannot be seen. They also wondered about the marks starvation might have left on his mind. Many prisoners of war carried nightmares with them, long after their bodies gained weight. Inside the barracks, other prisoners noticed that Carl could now stand through roll call without swaying. He could walk the yard slowly at first, then with more confidence. They clapped him on the back, gently, careful not to hurt him. He had become a kind of symbol, not because he had been a hero in battle, but because he had come so close to disappearing and had then pulled back. When finally his name appeared on a list of men scheduled for repatriation, he held the paper in shaking hands. He thought of the farm, of his parents, of fields that might be waiting or might be gone. He also thought of the medic who had looked at the scale and refused to treat him as just another number. Without that moment, he might never have seen his home again. Years later, long after the uniforms were put away and the camps dismantled, men like Carl carried the war in their bones. Extreme starvation at a young age can leave permanent marks. Some survivors from that time struggled with digestion for the rest of their lives. Others developed heart problems earlier than expected. Some one 18-year-old boy. The story of the teenager who arrived at a United States camp weighing just 72 pounds is not unique in its suffering, but it is powerful in its details. It shows how war strips away layers of identity until all that is left is a fragile body on a stretcher. It shows how a single medical examination can become a moment of moral awakening for people on the supposedly safe side of the wire. Prisoners of war are often reduced to numbers in official reports. They become figures in tables, totals in columns, nameless entries in transport lists. Yet each one had a life before the war, and many had lives after the war shaped by what they endured. Carl's weight, his age, and his struggle to recover turn an abstract history into something that can be seen and felt. Stories like this also challenge easy ideas about enemies. The American medics did not have to like the German prisoners of war to treat them. They had taken an oath to heal. In saving the life of a starving teenager, they were not excusing what his army had done. They were affirming a different set of values, ones that refused to let a young man die simply because he wore the wrong uniform. For listeners today, the image of an 18-year-old reduced to 72 pounds should raise questions that go beyond one war and one camp. How quickly can ordinary systems break under the pressure of conflict? How easily can a person be reduced to bones and numbers when resources run out and cruelty takes root? And what responsibilities fall on those who witness such damage, whether as medics, guards, or historians decades later? In the end, the story of Carl, the boy on the found that they could never fully shake the urge to finish every scrap of food on their plate. For Carl, every glance in the mirror in those early post-war years brought back the memory of the hospital mirror in the camp, where he had seen his own skeleton staring back at him. Even as he gained more weight and his muscles slowly returned, a part of him always remembered what it felt like to walk with legs that could barely hold him. The sound of a scale being tapped and reset could send him back to that day in the American camp hospital. He told his story rarely. Like many former prisoners of war, he found that people wanted simple narratives. They wanted heroes and villains, clear lines between right and wrong. What he had lived did not fit into easy categories. He had been part of an invading army, yet he had also been a starving teenager whose body had nearly given up. He had been held behind American wire and then saved by American hands. When he did share the story, he often began with that single number, 72 pounds. The number alone made people stop and imagine a body that light. Then he would describe the medic's face, the silence in the room, and the way the war had finally become real to those who examined him, not as a uniform but as a human being. His experience reminds listeners today that behind every statistic about prisoners of war, there were individual bodies and individual lives. Camp population numbers, ration charts, and transport counts matter because they tell us how systems worked. But the number on that scale, that day in that American camp, brought those numbers into sharp human focus. It forced everyone present to see what policies, shortages, and commands had done to stretcher is a reminder that the human body can endure unthinkable hardship, but it also has limits. When those limits are reached, survival often depends on small decisions made by others. A guard who calls a medic, a nurse who insists on more careful monitoring, a doctor who refuses to see a prisoner as just another entry on a chart. These choices, taken together, pulled one young man back from the edge. They turned a number on a scale from a death sentence into the beginning of a long, uneven road back to life. And they left behind a story that still has the power to stun anyone who imagines an 18-year-old weighing only 72 pounds and understands what it took to bring him home again.